Yes, I think it's time to open this conversation even wider here among you all. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask someone on the panel?
I'm interested in how an editor like Maxwell took editing on his own work, on his own fiction. Do you have access to his sort of editorial letters from his editor at Harper or at Knopf?
I edited a couple of his pieces. He wrote an introduction to a collection of short stories by Maeve Brennan for me when I was at Houghton Mifflin, and he wrote another introduction to an uncollected stories of Sylvia Townsend Warner. And we went back and forth on small things. And as a writer, he was grateful when I caught errors in fact, when I raised a question that allowed him to make a more considered response. But most of the time, as Dan said, I received little yellow stickies on things that would say, I really like it the way I did it. So, but there aren't too many editorial letters. There are some from the editors at HarperCollins when he was a young man trying to publish his novels. He seemed to be in a completely helpless state, like a turtle without a shell after he had submitted a novel to publication. And he was not sure of his work, at least in those early novels. And he took a lot of advice from people he thought knew better than he what a novel was, and he later regretted it. He had a very fortunate experience in midlife when Vintage approached him about reprinting all of his novels, and they gave him the opportunity to rewrite them. He didn't so much rewrite them as restore them. He went back and he took out all the changes that bad editorial advice had given him, and he put them back the way that he wrote them in the first place. So,
a stubborn son of a bitch in some ways. He really was.
He was totally stubborn. What I was going to say is I think if he didn't like changing his work at all. He regretted every change he ever made that editors had made, and when he had the chance to restore it later, he restored every single change he'd made that was significant, except for a few factual things that other editors had.
Like the ending of The Chateau, where he stood by his some explanations section, which doesn't kind of fit with the earlier sections, but he sort of defended it to the very end. Yeah. And also the dog.
In doing the Library of America edition, we took great care. We took great care to get the latest version of everything he did because we knew that it was closest to his intention. But,
well,
yeah.
If there's anyone in the world who could get in touch with you about anything you did that he didn't like, it would be Bill. I want to say
I still get letters, don't you?
It would be interesting to know. You said that he was like a turtle without a shell. I'm just wondering if there are any young novelists who have ever been turtles with shells when they were first submitting their work. It's interesting. I didn't know that about him. It's interesting to hear how sort of vulnerable he was, because he turned into a man of iron in some ways.
I think that with the Chateau in 1961 and the chance to restore those early works to a state that he could stand by, that he would never allow that to happen again.
Yeah.
There's a question back here.
Can you tell us anything about how he organized his writing life, juggling it with being the editor in New York?
When I was learning from him, and for many years before that, I started in 1969. He came in the office 3 days a week, and he saved the rest of his time for writing. And one of the things I wrote down in the notes that we're not supposed to use, so I didn't, is that he got so much done in those 3 days. It was astonishing. He was almost like an assembly line worker. of a very rarefied sort. He just worked. And it's interesting that he said to Ben that, you know, work hard and you won't regret it. He would come in at 9, he would work for 3 hours, he would have lunch, he would take a nap from 1 to 2 almost every day. He would get up and work some more. He never fooled around. And I think that's one part of the organization. I imagine his writing habits must have been equally disciplined, because he was absolutely professional he was a very cheery man, he was very movable, and he was very, in some ways, gentle, as we've all said, but he was a very professional literary man. And the letters and the editing and the stories he wrote show a kind of organization that I think a lot of writers have a hard time achieving.
And I remember him either saying or writing that he would go to his desk with sleep still in his eyes and work until noon.
Do you remember how he did interviews? His interviews were extremely peculiar, because he once, when he was young, was misquoted. And so he didn't like that anymore. And so after that, he liked to be interviewed live, but he would type his answers. I learned this firsthand because I did an interview with him for Double Take magazine. And I'd always thought it was very amusing till I was the interviewer. And you'd sit down with him and you'd ask him a question and he'd look at you and then he'd turn away and he'd type the answer. And then he'd pull out the piece of paper and give it to you, and then he'd watch you while you read it. And then if you had another question, it was a follow-up, you'd say, but what about this? And then he'd take the piece of paper back and put it back in the typewriter and type it some more. And then he'd give it back to you. Then if it was a new question, he'd hand you the piece of paper, he'd get a new piece of paper and type it out.
He did a Paris Review interview, right?
Yeah.
With George Plimpton, if I'm not mistaken. Did he do that?
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Same thing?
Yeah. I think he was so pleased. He was very pleased with the Paris Review interview. The fact that an interview could be as good as a piece of prose that he'd created himself. And it was after that experience that he demanded that he would only write written responses and also see proof of every interview so that he could really make sure that he said what he meant.
And yet, the interview with Kay Bonetti on the American Audio Prose Library is a wonderful live interview.
He didn't do that there.
It's marvelous.
He didn't do that on the radio.
You could hear the tapping. He said in the Paris Review interview, the most diagnostic thing about writing and writers that I've ever heard, I used it to myself and to other people all the time, he said that what he had found for the most part, that the common denominator among almost all writers was a sense of deprivation in childhood, if I'm not mistaken. And he said also to me that it didn't necessarily have to be deeply traumatic as it was for him. It depended on the nature of the child. But if a child is sensitive and perhaps talented and has an experience of deprivation, often parental, that's one of the things that drives people into writing.
Is there one more question?
I've got a quote on his reading of Sherwood Anderson from Ancestors here, talking about the Midwest and the Midwest of his era back in the teens and early 20s. Men and women alike appeared to accept with equanimity the circumstances, on the whole commonplace and unchanging, of their lives in a way that no one seems able to do now anywhere. This is how I remember it. I'm aware that Sherwood Anderson, writing about a similar though smaller place, saw it quite differently. I believe in Winesburg, Ohio, but I also believe in what I remember.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Stewart, Ben, Dan, and Ed.
Thank you. Great pleasure.